food, drugs, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. Can you take a moment to just introduce yourself to everyone and tell us what you do and what your lab studies?
My name is Vlad Vyazovskiy. I'm a professor of sleep physiology at the Department of Physiology, Anatomy and Genetics at Oxford University. So I've been here for about 12 years now. So I lead a research group with, as usual, with students, postdocs. We are studying sleep. We are studying neurobiology of sleep. But we are addressing this from different sides, from different angles. So we are trying to make sense of what happens in the brain when animals are sleeping. We are looking into questions such as why do we sleep, what sleep is about, what the function of sleep is. And I look at some other states which are related to sleep or connected in some ways. For example, we are working with a model of a torpor. Torpor is a hypometabolic state. So I work with hamsters who spend some time during the winter in this very interesting state called torpor. I also work a bit with psychedelics. So we have another project where we're looking at effects of substances like 5-MeO-DMT on brain activity and behavior, also in mice.
And so on your lab website, you start off by sort of giving a reason for why you're studying sleep and why it's interesting and all of that. And you say that, despite the exponential growth in what we've learned about sleep in the past few decades, it has not brought us closer to understanding what sleep is about in the first place, and that there is no theory of sleep yet. So can you just talk about that for a minute? What do you mean when you say things like we don't actually understand why animals sleep in the first place? Is it truly still a complete mystery, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, you will be surprised, of course, to hear, and many of your listeners, that we are still a bit in the darkness about why sleep is there. When we talk about the famous "why do we sleep" question, why has two sides. Is how come. We're talking here about regulation and mechanisms of sleep. So why sleep is there in the first place, or evolutionary origin. And another is biological purpose of sleep. So why do we sleep? Here we're talking about what's the benefit. So why do you need to sacrifice such a big chunk of your life for this very, very, very strange, very bizarre state? If you go to a sleep meeting, so there are many conferences happening on sleep. You talk to experts who spend some time, their entire career studying sleep, and it's very common that you sit down and start talking about trying to define what sleep is. So this is actually one of my favorite subjects or topics. So if you start dissecting, the closer you look at sleep, the less you understand what is it exactly that you're studying. And I think this is the main problem, and this is why we do not have a theory. We have very few theoretical frameworks in the field that would allow us to make good progress in this question.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess, naively, many people would say, well, obviously the point of sleep is it's recuperative. You need to sleep in order for your brain to function properly. But I guess maybe what you might say is, well, yes, but what exactly are you recuperating? What exactly in the neurons and in the cells of the brain and body needs this offline state to happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. This is one of the kind of mainstream directions in sleep research, the idea is that sleep is the price to pay for wakefulness. So you spend time awake, your brain is working hard, your body is working, it's active in many different ways. And then you need a restoration. You need restoration, recuperation, and this is what sleep is providing. So there is, of course, a lot of evidence that something like this may be happening, indeed. But we have, on the other hand, many examples of animals sleeping most of 24 hours, really sleeping a lot, which is very difficult to reconcile with the idea that sleep is just to provide restoration or recuperation. So I think there is just no way around. We must take it at the next level, and indeed, as you said, try to understand what is this restoration is about. It must be some kind of very advanced, very specialized, very elaborate way of restoration that only sleep can provide, right? Or another way, and we can talk more about this, the idea that sleep is a default state of the organism. So you spend your life asleep and you just wake up to satisfy your immediate needs, and then you go back to sleep. So you can turn this entire thing upside down. Sleep basically fills your time when you don't need to be awake.
And I suppose, the counter arguments to that would be that animals clearly spend quite a bit of time doing things that don't directly involve addressing their immediate needs, and humans would be a great example of one such a creature.
Humans are, I think, the worst experimental subjects you can imagine. Yeah. We probably don't need to be awake all the time that we are awake. Yes, we are somehow programmed spending our 7 or 8 hours asleep. Some of us can sleep much longer, but we have this approximately 7 or 8 hours, and then we have the rest of the time, 16 hours to do something. Most of us find something to keep ourselves busy, but also I think humans is the only species who can get bored, right? When there is nothing to do, you get bored and you suffer from that, and you're trying to find what is it to occupy yourself with.
Well, I mean, I can think of
animals.
I can think of a little child, right? When little children always say that they're bored, and they don't just stop and go to sleep every time they feel bored. They do the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. Well, this is of course a separate question about early development and early age, where sleep and wake have actually somewhat different meaning or potentially different meaning.
And maybe we should just start a little bit high level. On the one hand, we all know what sleep is from experience, but as a scientist, as someone who's studying this in the lab, studying it across species and so forth, how do you define sleep versus wakefulness? What are the key sort of pillars of what defines sleep?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sleep is by and large a behavioral state. I think this is probably the best and convenient way to start defining sleep. Sleep is defined behaviorally, and there are several criteria that were invented a long time ago. And this is, first of all, immobility or relative immobility. You move less or you don't move when you're asleep. You are also less responsive to the stimuli, or to put it slightly differently, I need to apply stronger stimulus to elicit a response, which again is a very interesting subject, and we can talk more about this if it is true or not. And then, if you look at different animals, we have a variety of specializations. So many animals have a specific sleeping site, specific sleeping posture, and so on. And all these defining criteria, they are explicitly behavior and brain centric. So this is a very convenient way to approach the question. If you look at a sleeping human or sleeping animal, in most cases, you just know that they're sleeping. And this is when it becomes difficult, because, it's always, if you have a dog, that the dog may look sleeping, and then you slam the door very quietly, shut the door quiet, and the animal turns the ear. And then you really start, okay, is there someone there or not? Is the dog actually sleeping, or it's then monitoring the environment? And this is when it becomes very difficult. Or on the other hand, there are many cases when animals can be asleep based on brain activity, but engaging in movement. again, talking about dogs, it's well known that they can they can twitch a lot. They can almost run when they're in the state called paradoxical sleep or rapid eye movement sleep. Again, is it sleep, or is it what kind of sleep is that? This is when it becomes a bit more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And then another yes.
Oh no, go ahead.
And then another level is what happens in the brain. We are using an approach called polysomnography in humans, and we can use a similar approach of recording brain waves, EEG, electroencephalogram, and some other signals also in animals. The first recording of whole night polysomnography was performed somewhere in 1960s in Stanford, but EEG as approach and sleep recordings with EEG were invented much earlier. And this is when scientists noticed that something very different happens in the brain. When you look at brain waves of an awake subject and a sleeping subject, it looks different. It just looks different visually. And then a whole night recording of sleep was obtained at some point, and this is when you also realize that there is a lot of complexity, a lot of heterogeneity during the night. So there are two different states of sleep, at least two different states of sleep, non-rapid eye movement sleep and REM sleep, and they change. There are about 4 or 5 cycles in humans. There are many, many more in animals, like in a laboratory mouse, it could be 50 cycles, which are very short, they're like 10 minutes long. And brain activity may look, especially during non-REM sleep, very different from wake. During a REM sleep, brain activity can look very similar to wakefulness. But again, there is a lot of overlap. So when you're tired, when you're sleep deprived, your brain activity may start looking more like a sleep than awake. Mm-hmm. So these are probably, just to sum up, two main approaches we use to define sleep. One is the behavioral state of inactivity and reduced responsiveness. Another is a different brain state where neural networks enter a different state and produce different kinds of oscillations.
Yeah. So at one level, we can define sleep behaviorally. It has to do with the extent to which the animal is behaving in its environment, reacting to external stimuli. But below that, if you start digging into what the brain is actually doing, there are multiple brain states within that one behavioral state that we can call sleep. And even though behaviorally animals are relatively quiescent, relatively inactive, there are exceptions to that to some extent. You mentioned, the dog sort of moving while it's sleeping. There are other examples we might talk about later where animals are moving around in more impressive ways. You can even think about things like sleepwalking, which occasionally happen in humans. But obviously there's something different about the brain state beneath that when those animals are asleep behaviorally. And so there's a lot to dig in here. But on the question of whether sleep is primarily or exclusively about the brain and about neurons, is there, one way to get at that question, I suppose, is there any kind of lawful relationship between, say, the amount of neural tissue an animal has and the extent to which it sleeps? Do animals with bigger brains sleep more? Is there even something like sleep or behavioral quiescence in non-neural systems?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. These are great questions and legitimate questions, of course. And but there is a big problem with kind of this way of looking at sleep, which is in fact very common. So first of all, we start with this concept of sleep, but I don't think there is like a unitary biological phenomenon which is equated to this label. Mm-hmm. So there is a lot of complexity behind, to the extent that indeed we started talking now about this phenomenon of so-called local sleep, or sleep at the level of neuronal assemblies or neuronal groups. So there's a lot of interest and a lot of research into this possibility that sleep does not even require the whole organism. That some very essential features of sleep can be found at the level of a neuron, even neural culture in a dish. So we have this preparation, so-called sleep in a dish, that several labs are working on. That if you put neurons together, they establish some connectivity and they start oscillating. They start producing type of activity very similar in some ways to what happens during sleep. So this means that, or another interesting preparation that was developed by someone, a colleague in Canada. So it's an isolated cortical slab. When a piece of the cortex was undercut, you cut the white matter that provides this inputs and outputs to this gray matter on the top. And you still make sure that there is blood supply to this island of cortex. And then you let it be there in situ, in the brain. So the animal is behaving, running around, doing stuff. And that part of the brain is disconnected, right? So it exists just by itself. So first it starts producing very, very abnormal activity, like a burst suppression, like when you're in a coma, in very deep coma or very deep anesthesia. But then after some time, after some days, it starts producing very beautiful, well-defined slow waves. The very slow waves we use to define sleep at the level of the whole brain. And then that piece of the cortex doesn't care what the rest of the animal is doing. The animal, for example, the animal goes between non-REM and REM sleep, where brain activity is very different, but this small piece of cortex is staying in non-REM sleep.
So it's in non-REM sleep continuously, always?
Continuously, yeah. Continuously for a long period of time. I don't remember for how long they were able to monitor activity in this isolated cortical slab, as they called it. But this led to this very, very interesting idea that you don't need the organism, you don't even need the brain to produce the type of activity that we use to define sleep. Right. So you see the problem is, right?
Yeah. So what you're saying is, so you can take an animal, scientists have done this, you can do a surgery on the animals to isolate one chunk of its brain from the rest of the brain. You basically just cut connections so that this one chunk of tissue in an intact brain, intact animal, is no longer talking to the rest of the brain, but still gets blood supply. It's still alive. It's still there. And it will basically look like it's asleep, even though the animal is awake and the other parts of the brain are doing other things. And then you can even take it further, you said. So you can have neurons growing in a petri dish. Now you no longer have a brain. You no longer have an animal or an organism that tissue is attached to. And the neurons, even in that highly reduced state, will still oscillate in ways that sort of look like the rhythmic activity you see in sleep?
Yeah, exactly. So this neuron, where this spontaneous activity is coming from is another question that scientists are trying to clarify. So there could be some intrinsic properties. So these neurons have a certain array of ionic channels that there is plasticity within this network. And the spontaneous activity can emerge from the configuration of this network. For example, if the neuronal population stays silent, we call it hyperpolarized. That means that the membrane potential is very low. And then this would activate certain ionic channels, which are activated just by being in that state and being hyperpolarized state. And they start passing sodium inside the cell, which would depolarize the cell. And this would eventually lead to the burst of activity and so on. So some spontaneous activity, like in the heart. So the mechanisms are actually remarkably similar to what happens in the heart, which can also beat without any input, any neuronal, any nerve.
External input.
External input. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So no stimulation is required for the heart to beat. So it's autonomous to some extent. Maybe when we are talking about this isolated cortical slab, it exists like that, like this island of activity, like an. I'm trying to find the right. I don't want to compare it to the heart, but the mechanisms could be actually quite similar.
I guess the idea here is that this sort of ties, I guess, at some level to the idea that sleep could be a default state, in the sense that, based purely on the intrinsic properties of neurons, so the types of proteins they have, the types of ion channels they have, in the absence of adding anything, by injecting activity into these, by having sensory organs like your eyes and your ears and everything, even when we think about something like the heart, it's a contractile organ. It's a very rhythmic organ. It does this automatically and spontaneously without any sort of extra input. I guess the idea here would be that neurons might just sort of intrinsically at baseline be these sort of rhythmic type of cells that, based purely on their biophysical properties and the way that their ion channels work and things like this, they might sort of by default have this sort of rhythmicity to their behavior.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is the idea that neurons that may not necessarily be the property of all neurons in the brain. So maybe some parts of the brain or some types of neurons are more likely to engage in this kind of activity. But this is really a very, very fundamental kind of property, and again, a good starting point for this discussion, that neurons do have this capacity to produce the type of activity that we believe are characteristic for sleep.
Mm-hmm.
But then maybe going back to your question, one of the problems. So you're saying whether you need the entire brain, if you need the nervous system, and so on. The problem is that our defining criteria for sleep, as I mentioned, they're explicitly brain-centric. They are brain-centric, brain and behavior-centric, right? So whether that you stop moving, you stop responding, you take a posture, you engage in some preparatory behaviors to sleep. So this is all brain. So we would always forget about the rest of the body, which is curious. It may be not as easy to monitor, or it's more difficult to make sense out of what happens on the periphery, although a lot is happening during sleep on the periphery. There is growth hormone increases massively during sleep, but we kind of conveniently kind of leave it aside, and we are focused on the brain because we define sleep by brain-centric criteria. And it's very difficult to get out of this kind of loop when you don't have vocabulary to talk about sleep with respect to what happens in the gut. Very few scientists kind of were brave enough to go in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess, even if I sort of, you mentioned that you can grow neurons in a dish and they will display activity patterns that are rhythmic and are reminiscent of the patterns you see in the brain of intact organisms. What if you have just non-neural systems? What if you just have cells in a dish or some kind of organism that doesn't have neurons at all? Are there similar rhythms in biology that we see in non-neural systems, maybe patterns of gene expression that wax and wane throughout the day that are, is it possible that sort of these rhythms are even more fundamental than neurons themselves?
Well, there will be many similarities among neuronal and non-neuronal cells, even if we talk about the brain, like astrocytes or some glia cells. So as far as we know, astrocytes cannot produce action potentials, or they're not electrically excitable cells, but certainly they have membrane potential. So they have potential across the membrane, which is very important. There's all cells in the body and in all organisms, including plants. There is always membrane potential that determines a lot of properties of the cell. Even though relatively few cells, as far as we know, now can produce what we call action potentials. This is what characterizes neurons and some other tissues like cardiac tissue. But then, you can definitely find similarities and differences. If you look at the transcriptome of different cell types, you can cluster different tissues based on the array of genes which are expressed in those tissues. What to make out of that is probably a separate question, right? So what is it that endows that tissue with properties that we believe is important for sleep, right? But I think we need to be careful with this approach because separating, kind of subdividing into different organs, cell types, and so on will inevitably artificial. So we can make some conclusions, but anyway, we have to put the system together to understand how it works. Like with neurons and astrocytes, neurons cannot really exist without glia, right? So there are many fundamental properties of the brain, of the neural networks, will not be possible without oligodendrocytes that produce myelin, or astrocytes, which are very important in kind of recycling potassium or glutamate. So we need to be careful with kind of taken out of the context.
And obviously we can think about sleep in our own lives because we all have to we all have to sleep, and we're very familiar with it in that way. And we can observe other animals. You were talking about dogs. We can talk about a number of other species, and clearly they sleep too. Any animal with a big brain. What are sort of the simplest animals and model systems in which there clearly is something like a sleep-like state? Do fruit flies or C. elegans worms living in the soil, do these sorts of smaller, simpler organisms that don't have such a big, elaborate brain like a mammal, do they also sleep or have some kind of sleep-like state?
Yeah, it's good that you mentioned the sleep-like state, because of course our initial criteria for defining sleep were developed for mammals. And then the further away you go from mammals, from large animals, the more difficult it becomes to apply the same criteria. For example, there is a big debate now in the literature whether reptiles, such as lizards, if they have REM sleep, because we are trying to enforce the criteria that were developed for mammals to a very, very different organism. And the same applies to sleep in general. But this is why behavioral criteria started with this reduced responsiveness, immobility, and also ability to compensate for lost sleep. We call it sleep homeostasis, are quite universal. So they're found across probably all or most living creatures, living organisms, speaking about animals right now, that were studied. I don't know what is the simplest organism that has been studied. I believe it's Hydra. Jellyfish. So what we are now discovering is that you don't even need a brain. You don't need the brain to sleep. You don't even need a nervous system technically, right? So as long as probably you need some excitable tissues, but you don't need the brain in our usual understanding of what brain is to produce a state that we would call sleep.
Interesting. And so I want to get back to this issue of sleep as a local versus global phenomenon. So if we just limit ourselves to thinking about animals with well-defined big brains, relatively speaking, we think about an animal like mammals, like humans, and we've got a big brain, we've got a cerebral cortex. Most of the time, obviously, sleep is globally regulated. Like I go to sleep, my whole person all at once, pretty much every night. But there are other animals that start to give us an indication that sleep doesn't need to be a whole brain phenomenon. So, for example, I believe certain marine mammals can sort of sleep one side of the brain and then the other side of the brain. And so like dolphins or sea lions and animals like this, I believe have been observed to sort of swim in a circle, and while one half of their brain is asleep and then the other half can go asleep separately. So that starts to indicate that sleep doesn't need to be a whole brain phenomenon. But how far can you take this in natural conditions? You mentioned the surgical conditions where we've seen local brain tissue sort of go to sleep or go into a sleep-like state when scientists manipulate the brain. But how local can natural sleep be in a fully intact animal?
Dolphins, unique hemispheric sleep in dolphins was, of course, a very, very, very interesting, very important discovery for the field. It's somewhat an extreme adaptation, as far as we know. I don't think such a degree of laterality or locality was found in any other organisms except marine mammals. So the same unihemispheric phenomenon of unihemispheric sleep was observed in several species of cetaceans and in some seals, although not all. This is obviously extremely interesting, unique, and we still don't understand how exactly it is regulated and how it is controlled. But as far as we know, and I really wouldn't be surprised if it is a very common, very widespread phenomenon, is that sleep is fundamentally local process. Even if you say that your you say you're sleeping your entire organism or your entire body or the brain. It's very easy if I put a lot of electrodes in your brain, and I definitely find some neurons which are active, which are more active than others.
Hmm.
You can look at occurrence of slow waves, which we already discussed earlier, which is a very important characteristic of sleep. And a colleague of mine, Yuval Nir, and several other labs looked at with many electrodes in patients who were implanted with depth electrodes because of course, for diagnostic purposes, they were patients with epilepsy. And you rarely or never find that the entire brain is experiencing a slow wave at the same time.
Hmm.
It is always slow waves in one part of the brain, and just a few millimeters or centimeters away, you don't have any slow wave. Even in a small brain like a mouse, so we also implant multiple electrodes, and even in this tiny brain, we find a lot of diversity. So the mouse brain never sleep at the same time everywhere. It's really like a degree. It's the correct approach is say not that you're awake and asleep, but what percentage of your brain is asleep or awake. Maybe this is
I
one
see.
way.
So even though an animal might be behaviorally asleep, I can go lay down in my bed and fall asleep. You're saying that if you were to measure the activity in different chunks of cortical tissue in the brain, much of the brain would be asleep, say in non-REM sleep, and you would see the slow waves and things like this. But you could have another chunk of tissue in the same animal in the same brain, very close by, and it basically is awake. It looks like the neurons are in an awake animal, effectively.
Mhm. Yeah, and yeah, exactly. And this represents an interesting kind of conundrum. So, does it mean that our approach to define sleep using these readouts of EEG or brain activity just inadequate,
Mm.
right? Or we are just missing something? There is a great example is a condition called paradoxical insomnia. So I'm not a clinician. I'm sure clinicians can tell you much more interesting stories. But the argument goes that these patients, they may uh, spend a beautiful night sleeping according to objective measures, according to our EEG recordings, and claim that they barely slept.
Hmm.
And then you show them the recording and say, no, you're lying. You spend 7 hours of you're sleeping better than I do. And they will say, no, I feel miserable. It was terrible. It was the worst night ever. So what do we make out of that? And it's interesting that this condition is called paradoxical insomnia or sleep state misperception.
Huh.
But it's almost like ridiculous, you know. So we are saying that the patient, so they are misperceiving their sleep.
Yes.
It's like we know better. So
Yeah. Yeah.
we record their brain waves and say
Yeah.
you
We're
as
assuming we're assuming that measurement is truly a faithful readout of their state.
exactly what
Yeah.
is yeah exactly. So what is the true measurements? What is more important, objective or subjective? And talking about sleep, there is actually a very poor correlation between objective measures of sleep and subjective measures.
Huh.
There are really nice studies which suggest that if you wake up the patient, the subject, and then you just ask them to reflect on how deep their sleep was. This is why actually I try to avoid this terminology of sleep depth because it's really misleading,
Hmm.
you know. And they would say, yeah, my sleep was really superficial, or someone would say, my sleep was so deep, yeah, I didn't exist at all, and it doesn't correlate really with slow wave activity. If anything,
Hmm.
it's the opposite.
Wow. Yeah,
But
normally when people talk about this, we talk about non-REM sleep having multiple stages. There's so-called deep sleep with slow waves. And the way that people talk about it implies that the more slow wave sleep you get, the more depth you had in your sleep, and therefore the more rested you should feel.
yeah, exactly. That's the kind of the approach, and I think where it's coming from. We love metaphors when we talk about
Mm.
sleep. You know, sleep depth. It's very intuitive, right? So deep sleep meaning very
Yeah.
restorative sleep when you're recovering and you're impossible to wake up. And indeed, like very early studies, they do suggest that you need to apply a stronger stimulus early in the night to elicit a response. right? And this would correlate with what happens with slow wave activity across the night, because slow wave activity is always highest early in the night in the first cycle, and then it goes lower, lower, lower. It describes this so-called process S that we can also discuss. But it's much more complicated than that. So if you look at these measures very closely, then if I try to systematically wake you up at different stages, then you may be as difficult to elicit a response during rapid eye moment sleep. Well, when there is no slow wave activity or much less. Right, but the arousal threshold, how we call it, can be similar to state with a lot of slow waves.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So if you so sleep depth is not a great terminology.
I see. Yeah, yeah. I guess that's always important to remind ourselves that this is terminology. These are linguistic terms or even metaphors that we're coming up with to try and understand things, but we are imposing them on something that we only have a fuzzy grasp on. And I suppose another thing that's coming to mind here for me is that there are various pharmacological interventions where you give people certain drugs and it completely changes their sleep architecture, but it doesn't necessarily result in subjective changes in sleep quality that you might expect. So, for example, my understanding is that drugs like SSRIs reduce REM sleep, and therefore you have more non-REM sleep, say. But if you have a drug that's making that kind of drastic change, you don't normally hear people say like, "Oh, well, I don't have good sleep, or I have extremely good sleep now." So the sleep architecture does seem to be dissociable from the subjectively felt quality of sleep, which I suppose would imply that, this is just me thinking out loud here, whatever cell biological mechanisms that underlie the recuperative function of sleep, they might be dissociable from the brain waves and things that we measure to characterize sleep normally.
Yeah, absolutely. SSRIs or monoamine oxidase inhibitors, these antidepressants that indeed have quite a profound effect on sleep. As you're saying, they can suppress or eliminate rapid eye movement sleep altogether. But again, it may also suggest that the defining criteria for REM sleep that we use, they are maybe insufficient or suboptimal to some extent, right? So how do we define REM sleep?
Mm-hmm.
So there is activated EEG, eye movements, and also muscle atonia,
Mm-hmm.
right? There are also some other phasic phenomena, but muscle atonia can also happen during non-REM sleep. So what may be happening with SSRIs is that some essential features of REM sleep simply merging into non-REM sleep, and they become less detectable. So we should, of course, I don't want to invent some explanation that is very difficult to test, but we should always be open to this possibility, knowing that this property of sleep, that is always like a mixture of different states, and sleep is very, very dynamic state.
Yeah, and I guess that makes a lot of sense intuitively. Like these are pretty coarse-grained measures. When you talk about something like non-REM versus REM sleep, these are defined by the EEG largely. And basically what you're saying is there's probably lots of different components to each state under normal conditions, and it is possible under other conditions to sort of mix and match those components in ways that, just because you have a suppression of the EEG signal normally associated with REM sleep doesn't mean that everything that underlies that state goes away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And again, here we are just talking about humans.
Yeah.
And this is why it's so important and so interesting to look at how different other animals sleep, right? Because this is when you realize that what we think is important for humans, for sleep being restorative, may be completely irrelevant or not the case at all in other animals. Right? We are. Mm-hmm.
What would be an example of that?
One example. Sleep cycle. So in humans we have, as I mentioned, 4 or 5 non-REM cycles. All right. If you look at birds, many birds have much less REM sleep. on the other hand, they may have just very brief, like a few seconds lasting episodes of sleep, which we can with some certainty label REM sleep. But some other animals, like ferrets, may have 45% of their sleep time, like almost half of their sleep time is in REM sleep, and they also have two different kinds of REM sleep. We call them two different types of REM sleep. It was described by a couple of labs. Actually, I was involved also in a collaboration here in Oxford. We recorded sleep in ferrets. So they do have three sleep stages, not non-REM and REM sleep, but they have distinct three sleep stages. We don't know what to do about that. Okay, does it mean that their sleep is more restorative, or like, right? If you see where I'm going, so what's the meaning of these features of sleep which we believe are important?
Yeah. It's just, I guess, basically what you're saying in essence is, we've come up with these terms using things like EEG patterns, things like behavioral criteria, non-REM sleep, REM sleep, deep sleep, slow. Like we have all of these terms to describe these things, and they map onto some criteria, but we don't actually have a firm handle about how all of those objective measures actually relate to what's happening for the organism, the underlying function. And so we can't simply look at an animal and be like, they've got this much REM sleep, therefore they are sleeping more deeply or less deeply or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And this is why it's really important that we look beyond our human species at other species. There was another series of studies lately in like very unconventional animals that some labs are now actually venturing into the wild. They managed to capture those animals, even put electrodes, and then they have to recapture them to retrieve their devices. And I'm talking about one study, for example, about sleeping penguins. I don't know if you heard of that. So it was published last year, I believe, and together with my former graduate students, we all wrote an editorial on that. It was in the Science magazine, and the study was led by Paul-Antoine Liburel. So he's a very talented engineer. So this is exactly who we need in our field, who he actually knows what he's doing when he's implanting electrodes and recording electrical signals. So he goes to Antarctica. They capture penguins. They implant electrodes. And penguins, they live in these big colonies.
Yeah.
Thousands of birds, and they're sitting on the eggs, and then they have chicks. They have to defend them because they're trying to steal nesting material from each other. There are some predator birds who also want to do.
So to stay awake, I would imagine, for long periods.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point. How can you sleep if you're in this environment? So what do you think these birds are doing? Any thoughts? Any ideas?
The first thought that comes to my mind is perhaps it's something akin to the local sleep phenomena we talked about before, where they can maintain behavioral vigilance to some extent, but part of their brain goes offline for some amount of time, but not the whole thing.
Yeah, they do. They do some of that, but overall, they basically never engage in a consolidated sleep. So they accumulate actually quite a lot of sleep if you sum up all these micro episodes. They call them micro sleeps, lasting just a few seconds at a time. So basically, they're dozing off like
they
that.
They doze off many times.
Yeah. But they basically, on average, they almost always vigilant, and they're watching what is going on. So their sleep is kind of fundamentally different from how we sleep and how we think sleep should be.
Yeah. And of course, everyone can probably think of their own life of cases where they're sleep deprived, they haven't slept in a while. You start to doze off a little bit, and you can doze off. I mean, there's been cases in my life where I'm traveling in airports or whatever, and you doze off multiple times, but it doesn't feel recuperative. It certainly doesn't feel like you could last for days and days in that way.
Yeah, exactly. But you see, this is one of those unique adaptations, like with dolphins.
Yeah.
Because the simplest thing, again, this is how argument goes. The simplest thing would be just to get rid of sleep altogether, right?
Right.
If sleep were not important. But animals develop these unique adaptations, like unihemispheric sleep, or like this sleep split into thousands and thousands of microsleeps. I mean, of course, our definitions of sleep break down completely. This means that sleep can come in many different forms, but it also tells us something very fundamental, that sleep must be there one way or another. It has some function, it has some role. Because otherwise, I mean, the only alternative explanation, as I mentioned at the
Yeah.
beginning, is that sleep is just a default state. You always gravitate to the sleep state. If there is nothing else to do, no stimulation, you go to this default mode. And it's not like you're dozing off and you just go back to sleep, right?
Yeah.
So when you can afford.
Yeah. And I guess, if I step back for a second, I think by analogy with like other fundamental drives that organisms have that, we understand more, all animals need to, I'm just going to talk about animals for now, but this is even deeper than that. All animals need to create energy, right? We all have to, our cells need ATP. We need to ingest material from the outside environment. We need to eat. We need to obtain nutrition and calories. And we understand that at some level, right? We know that animals need to eat because we need to make ATP, and we've worked out at the cellular level, sort of what the mechanisms there are. We know that there's, an electron transport chain in our mitochondria. We understand that our cells need to make ATP molecules because that's going to be the energy currency that enables our cells to function. So there's sort of a fundamental cell biological explanation for why animals need to ingest food from the environment. But if you didn't know that yet, and you were just looking at animals and you were completely naive about all of that stuff, obviously all animals are ingesting things, but they're doing it in radically different ways. And sort of what you're started to tell us is that all animals do need sleep, but they do it in radically different ways. Sometimes you've got 1,000 microsleep environments in a penguin. Sometimes you've got, a single 7 to 8 hour session in a human. And there's all of these different ways to sleep. But I would think that there must be some kind of fundamental cell biological essence to sleep that is a common denominator here. And I'd love, is that the way you think about it? And if so, is that really what the mystery is still?
Yeah, this is the main mystery, and this is the main question. So we start with this observation that all or most animals sleep in some way, and therefore the argument goes, and you do this at the expense of other very important things. So there must be a reason for that. And there is a lot of interest in the field. Many labs are looking at various processes that may explain this. The kind of standard approach is to start with wakefulness. Mm-hmm. Look at what is unbalanced or depleted or broken down or accumulated, etc. I can continue forever. During wakefulness, that would need to be renormalized, restored, returned to baseline during sleep.
Yeah.
This is how the kind of the overall approach goes. It was, I don't even know what was the very first study that that looked at sleep this way. So I believe more than 100 years ago, cats or dogs were sleep deprived, and then their cerebrospinal fluid was extracted and injected to a normal dog, rested dog, and it would become sleepy. So I'm sure it was a awful experiment. So the dog probably
but the idea is some kind of metabolite or something was accumulating throughout the wakefulness period, and it was sufficient to induce sleep. That's the idea.
Yeah, exactly. And then more recently in the 70s, 80s, some of our colleagues, they decided to kind of take it seriously. They were doing a lot of experiments of this kind. They were trying to purify those substances. One of the substances that was eventually isolated as a sleep-promoting substances was a muramyl dipeptide, which is the component of a cell wall of bacteria. So it comes basically not even from us, but from microbiome. This led to a very interesting and very influential line of research on the immune factors like cytokines or interleukins, TNF alpha that were somehow implicated in this function. again, it's intuitive when you are sick, right? Then your sleep drive is very high.
Yeah.
So we spend so again, this could be for many reasons, but there was a lot of research. But then a scientist, and this work was led by James Kruger in the US. They would start infusing those cytokines in the brain, and they found that it led to increase of local slow waves. This was actually one of the first demonstration of local sleep regulation.
Hmm.
Something similar, another line of research was focused on a molecule called adenosine. Adenosine, and you mentioned ATP. Adenosine basically results from breakdown of ATP, ADP, AMP, and then adenosine. Adenosine is a very interesting molecule. So it's not a classical neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are those biologically active molecules which are accumulated in synaptic vesicles, and they're released, and they're activating or inhibiting their targets. Adenosine is also released by cells, but it's very short-living. It is not accumulated in vesicles, but it has receptors. So it's a classical neurotransmitter or neuromodulators. It binds receptors on the target cells and induces some biological effects. And there was evidence that adenosine levels increase during wakefulness. Basically, at least in some brain areas, the longer you stay awake, the higher level of adenosine, which is probably not surprising because brain is active, neurons are active, more ATP is consumed, and you need to, as you stay awake, you need more and more ATP to maintain the same level of activity. And then you can take adenosine or some agonists of adenosine receptors. You can infuse in the brain, and it would again produce either slow waves or make the organism fall asleep.
Mm-hmm.
And you can do the converse. You can counteract this mechanism. And of course, caffeine is a very famous example because one of the targets of caffeine is blockade of adenosine receptors, and this keeps you awake and alert. So these were two kind of research directions that looked at these mysterious substrates for sleep need or sleep pressure that accumulates during waking. And there were many others. So another research direction, which is actually was revived recently, is that oxidative stress is increased in metabolically active cells, and this is something that is potentially dangerous. So you need to engage some restorative processes to deal with consequences of oxidative stress. Another direction is synaptic plasticity.
Mm-hmm.
So again, the argument goes that during wakefulness, synaptic plasticity is happening, probably in both directions, but there is probably more evidence that synaptic connectivity is strengthened during waking. And again, the argument goes, it cannot increase indefinitely. You need to renormalize it.
Yes, I guess, one idea would be, just to riff on some of this stuff, if you're awake, you're doing stuff, the animal's behaving, neurons are firing, everything's happening. There's all of that requires energy, obviously. So you're using up some of your fuel, so to speak. You might have things like adenosine accumulate as a consequence of that. And as these things accumulate, potentially energy sources are running down, and or the byproducts of being awake and having our cells do stuff. There's an accumulation of stuff, whatever that stuff may be, that then interferes with the continued functioning of the cells that allow for behavior to happen. And therefore, you need to go to sleep in order to take care of those things, to renormalize them, whatever exactly that means. But I guess if we start to think about this from a neural standpoint and a learning standpoint, if an animal's awake and it's taking in information and it has to learn things and remember things and so forth, synapses need to be strengthened, they need to be weakened, et cetera, perhaps doing all of that stuff, achieving all of that stuff at the cellular level can't happen while the animal's awake, because I guess one way to start to think about it would be, for an animal to learn, its synapses have to change, the channels have to go into and out of the membrane, the neurons have to change in some way, and perhaps the cell can't do that if the animal is awake and behaving. Perhaps it needs some kind of quiescent state to shuttle proteins around and clean up junk and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So again, this is the main idea. So you can think again of some metaphors that you do some repair of an like underground metro during the night when
Mm-hmm.
trains are
Right,
not
right.
running all the time. Yeah, you need to kind of slow things down, and this is when you can check what is right, what is wrong, and fix what is needed. Again, it makes intuitive sense, right? So
Mm-hmm.
whether it is true, I mean, again, we depend a lot on this kind of intuitive way of looking at things, right? So if it makes sense to us because we can compare it to something that is familiar to us, that makes sense to us, and we would take this as a possibility or truth.
Mm-hmm. So what is so one idea that's out there that you've been involved with at some level is this idea of synaptic homeostasis being a very important function of sleep. My understanding is that basically if you look in the brain on average, throughout a period of wakefulness, there's a net potentiation of synapses. So basically we're awake, we're taking in information, we're doing stuff. Many synapses are getting stronger or need to get stronger, and that requires things like protein synthesis, protein shuttling. But then, of course, you can't just sort of indefinitely build all of your synapses up and up and up. Because that you don't have resources to do that forever and ever, cellular resources, but also because right, part of learning is forgetting. We don't want to remember all of the information we take in. We want to retain some of it and forget the rest because it's extraneous or not adaptive. And perhaps sleep is somehow involved in scaling back or renormalizing synapses in that type of way. Can you talk about what this synaptic homeostasis hypothesis is and how strongly the evidence is out there for it?
Yeah, the synaptic homeostasis hypothesis was proposed now more than 20 years ago by Giulia Tononi and Chiara Cirelli, who are now at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In some way, it was motivated. Well, there is, of course, some kind of history behind. So, first, I would like to talk briefly about the idea of sleep homeostasis.
Mm-hmm.
And sleep homeostasis is one of the very influential frameworks still for more than 40 years, proposed by Alex Borbey, and then in collaboration with Sergi Dan, who was a chronobiologist. They developed the model. According to this model, sleep need or sleep pressure builds up during wakefulness, and it dissipates during sleep. And it can be mathematically described as a build up of this process as and then decrease, and then you can describe it with some time constants, how quickly it increases and how fast it goes down. And a correlate of this process is slow wave activity, which we already talked a lot about today. It's very easy to measure. If I record your EEG, and I know that early on when you just go to sleep, there's a massive increase in slow waves, and they're dissipating during the night. So we definitely know that there is some process of this kind happening.
Mm-hmm.
And Julian Chiara proposed that synaptic strength, net synaptic strength, as you said, because yeah, some synapses can go up, some down, but overall synaptic weights across the brain, across all synapses, could be the variable that reflects this process.
Hmm.
There was a lot of excitement in the field when this hypothesis was published because, as I said, we have so few hypotheses, so few theories, even if they are wrong, and of course, inevitably they will be too simplistic, or but it's really stimulating for the field when some ideas of this kind, which again very elegant, very intuitive, are proposed. And then the field started testing this hypothesis. There was a lot of work. It was controversial, so there was evidence against this idea. There was a lot of evidence, mostly indirect, in support of this idea. Of course, it turns out to be much more complicated, much more interesting than, I don't know, one can look at superficially. It's very interesting. It's still alive. This idea is still alive. It's successful. So the most convincing evidence that has been provided already a few years back when they measured actually a physical size of synapses, the synaptic contacts. It was extremely laborious, so they worked for years manually reconstructing dendrites and synaptic spines and their contacts. They measured many, many thousands, and it looks like overall, indeed, there is synaptic contacts are smaller after sleep compared to wake.
So there is evidence if you physically look, I'm guessing with electron microscopy and other methods, maybe like that, that after sleep, on average, synapses do seem to get smaller. So there's some kind of maybe scaling back that's happening.
Yeah, exactly. So there is this rather solid evidence. This is probably as close to ground truth as it can possibly get. These experiments are very difficult. And of course, you have just a few time points, right? So you have either after wake or after sleep. But synapses are incredibly plastic. So things can change on a time scale of, if not minutes, maybe dozens of minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we need much more work to understand the dynamics of this process, right? You don't get tired after 1 hour of being awake, right? You get tired after many hours of being awake, and then you need to sleep for quite a while, right? To go back. So we still need to really understand better the dynamics of this process, and if indeed synaptic connectivity that accounts for this process. So where in the brain, how it happens, on what time scale, and what does it mean, right? What does it mean? We can have some ideas for learning, for example, but how this happens. I think this is probably the most important and unresolved question. So there is this magic in between. So we have variables before, variables after, and they change. But how exactly? What is it about wake that increases synaptic weights? Right? You say learning. Okay, but what learning does, right? So you can go to absurd level of the same about sleep. It's a mystery, right? It's a mystery. What is it about sleep that makes you feel better when you wake up? We still don't know how it works. We especially again as animals sleep in so many different ways. Slow wave activity again often is at the center of attention. This is why there is a lot of interest to develop an approach for sleep enhancement. Means that you stimulate the brain to elicit slow waves. Right? You can do it transcranial magnetic stimulation or some sensory or auditory stimulation. You probably this closed loop approach that is becoming extremely popular, which to me is curious because we still don't know what slow waves are actually doing, but everybody is trying to enhance those to make you sleep better and feel better and have better memory.
So people are trying to enhance sleep quality or sleep depth by enhancing slow waves. And I guess what you're saying here is that, we still don't know yet if those slow waves are causally involved in the recuperation that animals get from sleep, or if they're merely a close correlate of whatever is happening under the hood.
Yeah, exactly. So we know that slow waves are there. We know that they are homeostatically regulated, that they're high when your sleep pressure is high, and then they're reduced when you're about to wake up and you feel great. There was a very nice study. Again, I'm always going back to animals. There was a very nice study where EEG was recorded in deer. No, and in deer, yes. Actually, yeah, it's another remarkable. So someone put electrode. Of course, yeah, you need to be very careful. You don't drill the hole in the skull. You just you put. And then you know what deer are doing, or sheep, or the ruminants. They're chewing, right? So they're regurgitating food stuff and they're chewing. They're chewing a lot while being in this kind of sleep-like state. It's extremely difficult actually to tell whether the animal is sleeping or not when it is chewing, right? Because there's all these muscles. They're very rhythmically activated. the brain is completely in this mode of
Yeah,
which
just as an artifact of the chewing.
exactly it could be
Yeah.
artifact. It could be also that there is some entrainment, right? So
Yeah.
you see where I'm going, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
you can enter this very almost like meditation state when your
Yeah.
brain doing rhythmically this stuff
Yeah. I mean,
in
that's
a very
that's like what
relevant
that's what
frequency.
meditation and prayer in humans really is, right? You're sort
Yeah,
of
like
engaging in a
breathing.
yeah.
Yeah, we know that breathing in trains is a very powerful a factor that entrains brain activity. So, and these animals are chewing, producing a lot of this quasi slow waves. I don't know how to call them. And the scientists who did this study actually found that the more the animals spend time ruminating, chewing, the more the stronger dissipation of sleep need is observed
Hmm.
from sleep before to after. It looks like they're discharging some of this sleep pressure encoded, reflected in sleep slow activity by chewing.
Hmm.
Right, so you don't need to sleep. Maybe someone could try just if you do this, and maybe it's all you need at the end of the day.
Hmm. Interesting. I mean, one thing I want to ask you about is sleep. So if we were trying to think about this problem of what is sleep and what is it doing, one other angle that's interesting here to me is just like any other trait, there's variability within populations. So if we're thinking about a single species, a single population, there's going to be some variability in the amount of sleep each individual needs each night. Right. So we know, for example, in humans, we know that most humans need adult humans that are normal and don't have some pathology. Right. Most of us need about 7 to 8 hours per day of sleep, but some people can get by with 7, some need 8 or 9, some might even get away with 6 or might need 10. And obviously that's more rare, but that does happen. Is there anything that we know about the variability in sleep need per day within populations that might somehow point to what's missing, or what do the people who need less sleep have that the other people don't? Is there what accounts for that individual variability?
Yeah, okay. First, before I answer the question, I have some objection for the word need, because the fact
Mm,
that you have something doesn't mean that this is what you need, right?
yeah, yeah,
Because for many reasons. First of all, if you have 7 hours, maybe because you have an alarm clock, and most of us, we can curtail our
yeah,
sleep.
yeah,
The environment has such a massive effect on our sleep that, yeah, to determine the
yeah.
true amount of sleep is not easy at all.
And I
So
guess I guess
talking
even when
about
you have people who claim they only need 6 hours, maybe there is some deficit there, but they just power through it.
Yeah, but of course, there is good evidence that if you look at the amount or duration of sleep, it's very much like normally distributed.
Yeah.
So as you said, most of us have about 7 or 8 of hours of sleep. It doesn't mean that we need it, but we have it,
Yep.
right? And there are some extremes, so it's a very beautiful normal distribution. You can focus, of course, who's most interested in the extremes, right? So, and scientists look at this, what they call short sleepers and long sleepers,
Hmm.
and you call them as such only if they do the same also on the weekend. So when there
Mm.
is no fact, they don't have to. There is
Yep.
nothing outside
There's
that
no
actually.
no alarm clock. There's no pressure to sleep less or more, but they do it naturally.
Exactly. And they still sleep less, or they still sleep more.
Hmm.
Uh, Again, going back to this sleep need, whether they need it. Um, uh, two ways to look at this. One is that sleep could be, as again, an old view could be, how they call it, obligatory and luxury. So some of our sleep is non-negotiable. For whatever reason, we must produce it or obtain it, or and the rest we just fill the time when there is you don't need to be around. So this is one way to look at it. Another is the capacity for sleep. For example, when we get older, many of us would sleep less, but we are still debating. Is it because we need less sleep, or because we are incapable to produce
Yeah.
sleep that we actually need?
Yeah. Maybe there's a breakdown of the mechanisms that produce sleep, and even though we
Yeah.
really could use it, we just can't generate it.
Yeah, exactly. But then another beautiful experiment was when these extreme short sleepers and long sleepers were put in a time-free environment. And if I remember correctly, they all kind of over time gravitated closer to the this middle. So those
Hmm.
who were in the real world, or I don't know how you call this world,
What do you mean by time-free environment?
meaning that they were like in a bunker.
Ah,
They didn't have the phone, they didn't
there's
have
no
the
external
TV.
cues as to what time it is.
Exactly, yeah. Can you imagine? Yeah, this is really the very interesting experiment that started actually quite a long time ago, maybe 60s or 50s last century, with Jürgen Aschoff doing classical
Hmm.
circadian experiments
Wow.
in
Was this
time frame.
people like experimenting with the possibility of like a nuclear event or something where people are in a bunker?
Yeah, probably the bunker was built for different
Yeah,
purpose,
yeah.
probably since the Second World War,
Okay.
but it was
Wow.
perfect for
Yeah.
circadian experiments,
So
right?
you
When
put
you
you put people in a bunker. Some of them normally sleep less. Some of them normally sleep more than the average. But if you put them in this bunker, they can't see the sun. There's no cell phone. There's no external cue. They start to converge and move
yeah.
towards the center.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I don't promise that this particular study they did in the bunker, but yeah, so
Yeah,
they
yeah.
did it in a setting where they had no clue what time is. So there are other very interesting phenomena emerge in the time-free environment. For example, a phenomenon called free running. Free running phenomenon emerges from the fact that our endogenous period is never exactly 24 hours.
Mm,
So it's normally it's slightly less, I believe, and this means that yeah, every day you wake up slightly earlier. So you basically you shift relative to the world outside.
mhm.
The same we find in lab mice, in basically any animal. So we have endogenous period close to 24 hours, no, never precisely, and this is why you shift. You every day either wake up either earlier or later. So these are very interesting classical experiments. But basically, what they tell us is the role of the environment, how important it is. When we try to make sense of our sleep need or the amount of sleep, if you think most of what we know about sleep comes from very artificial conditions, either
Mhm.
very abnormal conditions like our usual life, when we have so many factors that affect our sleep in a sometimes completely unpredictable way, or another extreme, we studied sleep in the lab, where conditions are so predictable, standard, sterile, they're so remote from conditions where sleep evolved that you again get some sort of distorted picture.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is why, yeah, we talking about sleep need, we don't really know what is our actual sleep need,
Hmm.
right? And to some extent, I think it's flexible. Uh, there are some, again, beautiful experiments in animals. This study was in birds, in jackdaws, and in starlings, a group in the Netherlands. They kept these birds in conditions either with a long day, like during the summer, and short day, as in the winter. And they would change it basically from day to day. And they did this experiment in actual summer and actual winter. The bottom line, these birds, they sleep when it's dark. Literally from one day to another, they could get or lose about 5 hours of sleep, which means that maybe indeed they're sleeping because it's dark, there's nothing to do, and this is why you spend time asleep. But this really tells us something about important, that our concept of sleep need may be very misleading. Because so do these birds need 5 hours of sleep or 10 hours of sleep if they can produce 5 or 10 depending on the conditions?
Mhm. I want to ask you about hibernation a little bit. And I'm not sure what you've done in particular there. I'll let you steer the ship. But if I start to think about hibernation now, and I think about, okay, well, you said there's an idea that, okay, maybe sleep is the default state. Maybe you only need to be awake to satisfy your basic needs like finding food and water and so forth, and then sleep is sort of like the default. it actually makes that idea sort of makes sense to me if I think about animals that hibernate, because, if I'm a grizzly bear, and during the wintertime, it's brutally cold outside. It's dark most of the time. There's not a lot of food out there. So hibernation makes sense. I'm just going to build up my fat stores and I'm going to hibernate in a cave because there's no point in being awake. I'm not going to find mates. I'm not going to find food, and so on and so forth. What is, well, let's just start with the basics though. Like, what is hibernation or torpor, and how is or isn't that similar to regular sleep?
Yeah. This is a really, really fascinating subject. So torpor is kind of an umbrella phenomenon that
Mm-hmm.
refers to a state of reduced metabolism,
Mm-hmm.
reduced metabolic rates, reduced amount of oxygen consumed and CO2 released. And we are talking about rates of all kind of processes, physiological processes in the body, like heart rate or
Mm-hmm.
breathing. So torpor can be of different kinds. It's probably like it falls into two clusters, although sometimes it's represented as a continuum. One is like multi-day seasonal hibernation, which can be very deep, so the body temperature can reduce to basically freezing point.
Hmm.
And another phenomenon is called so-called daily torpor. This is when animals cool down and their metabolic rates decrease for just a few hours every day or almost every day,
Hmm.
like in some small rodents, for example, hamsters, which I have in my lab here. And these are kind of two different types of torpor. Torpor and hibernation are defined by metabolic rates. Sometimes they are considered a state when your body temperature decreases, which is not true, because there are although it's very common for hibernating animals for the body temperature to decrease, it does not have to for animals to be in a state of hibernation.
Hmm.
Bears, as you mentioned, have just a few degrees Celsius decreased temperature, and there are tropical primates that hibernate at very high ambient temperature. Obviously,
Hmm.
they don't cool down, but their breathing rate decreases a lot, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
So the animals, this is when it becomes interesting, that when animals are hibernating, they look like they are sleeping.
Mm-hmm.
Their body posture, the way they respond or don't respond. But we define sleep by brain-centric criteria, as we were discussing. When define hibernation by metabolic rates, more like peripheral.
Mm.
We still know very little about what happens in the brain when animals hibernate. This is my main interest. So I
Mm.
have my hamsters. I'm looking what happens in the brain when they are experiencing this very, very strange state. But the two states are related. So as far as we know, animals enter hibernation via sleep. So you cannot start decreasing your metabolic rates while running around.
Mm-hmm.
You need to fall asleep, and then sleep kind of opens the gate to this hypometabolism. But paradoxically, when animals emerge from hibernation or emerge from torpor, from daily torpor, and this has been shown for at least a few species, they behave like they're sleep deprived. They're like tired. So they
Huh.
go to sleep and they produce the most beautiful sleep with a lot of slow waves, exactly as they do if I keep them awake, like playing, giving them toys and entertaining them for hours.
Mm-hmm.
So there is this very interesting relationship between torpor and sleep, not really well understood.
I see. So
Yeah,
when, as far as we know, when animals enter a state of torpor or hibernation, they enter it via sleep. But then, a bunch of time passes. They might be in this hibernation state for quite a while. And then when they wake up, they don't seem like they're well rested. They seem like they're sleep deprived. And so I guess
exactly.
that would
Yeah,
imply that perhaps whatever is happening in between the initial bout of sleep and waking up, it would suggest that perhaps it's not a restful sleep like state, it's some other state.
yeah, exactly. And this is really going back to most of our discussion today. This observation is really an important challenge, but also opportunity for our existing theories of sleep, right? So we talked about a lot about synaptic homeostasis, or I don't know, accumulation, some products of metabolism. But there is no metabolism, and you
Yeah.
are
They're
not really learning
hypometabolic.
much while
They're
you are
not learning.
hibernating.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Or you're learning something different in different ways that we cannot imagine yet, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So yet sleep must happen, and sleep pressure is very high. So I think it's just incredibly interesting phenomenon that we need to study, and I'm trying to study in my lab.
Hmm. Why would so while I would just I didn't know this was true, but you mentioned that there's some primates in tropical environments that hibernate or enter torpor. Why would that be? I would have thought that in a stable environment that doesn't have extreme seasons where food is plentiful or not available, or maybe that's the case and I just don't realize it. Why would that environment have an animal that goes into such a state?
Saving energy. It's again what you said, that torpor could be the true default state is exactly how I like to
Hmm.
look at torpor and hibernation. So
Hmm.
when there is nothing else to do, you go to this very to me it's almost like a very prime primal state. I don't know,
Hmm.
very
Hmm.
is the default in a primordial state, right?
Yeah.
So this is why the animals cool down. They're closer to thermal equilibrium with the environment. They don't spend any energy for resisting the environment, right? They really merge with the surrounding. So this is to me a true default state when you are become kind of one with the environment in a way.
Hmm.
And this makes a lot of sense. And this is what these primates do. So they don't spend energy. So definitely they don't have to spend energy to keep themselves warm because it's warm outside.
Right.
But their body temperature basically starts fluctuating together with the environment. But their heart rate, their metabolic rates can decrease a lot by 70%. So they save in a lot of energy just becoming one
Huh.
with the outside.
And so, to the extent this view is directionally true, that, something like this is more the default state, it would imply that, most animals that we observe when they're awake and behaving, it's that it could be to a large extent that they're doing that out of necessity. And that the reason they don't as often go into these states is because they're in an environment where they can't. Maybe it's too risky and they would get picked off by a predator or whatever.
Mhm. Yeah, and this is why this capacity to hibernate or enter torpor is associated with longer lifespan. So there is an idea, and there is good evidence that uh, 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 hibernating helps you survive predation. Right? So this is actually interesting angle, because sometimes when we discuss why we need to sleep, um, and the argument goes that you're more vulnerable to predation because you're less responsive to the stimuli outside. But in some cases you can be actually very well protected because you are not out there walking around in the environment to which you are not adapted.
Yeah.
Uh, so this is again, there is this idea around it. It probably was proposed in different ways. A colleague of mine here, Russell Foster. So he says there is no mystery to sleep. Sleep is just to keep you out of trouble, right? So when you in the dark forest and you don't see anything, so why would you wander around? So there
Yeah.
must be a mechanism to make you disappear from
Yeah. I
and
guess, it
hide
makes,
away.
yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So it's probably easy for people to forget this because in the modern environment we live in, it's not like it was at one point. But if I imagine camping in Yellowstone Park and there's bears and wolves outside, the safest place for me to be is to sleep in my tent. If I'm
Mhm,
walking around, that's no longer the
mhm.
case. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Because yeah, predators, they would be attracted by you moving around, but also if your metabolic rates decrease, you become less noticeable. You
Mhm.
see, you cannot your if your body temperature is closer to the surrounding, you're producing less odors.
Yeah.
You become less noticeable. So it's actually very, very clever way to
Hmm.
survive. So
It's,
you
it's
you
almost a
need
form
to
of
be.
camouflage. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Or mimicry. I don't know. I wrote this article recently for Aeon where I compared hibernation with a very elaborate form of mimicry, that you are really pretending to not be there. You're pretending to not be even alive. And this is a very, very clever strategy to survive.
What so when we talk about normal sleep, so not hibernation or torpor. What is the relationship between sleep and metabolism? Now, I want to distinguish here between the periphery and the brain. Now, obviously, I can imagine that in the brain it's complicated. Metabolism is going to necessarily be shifting in different ways across the different phases of sleep and stuff. But just in terms of whole body metabolism and metabolic rate and body temperature and things like this, what is the relationship between sleep and metabolism? Is our metabolism and body temperature dropping when we sleep? Is it fluctuating up and down? What do we know about that?
Well, metabolic rates, as far as I know, this is a bit outside of my area of expertise, so I cannot give you a kind of big lectures. So there is definitely decreased metabolic rate during sleep. It's not massive, it's not pronounced.
Mm-hmm.
It may depend a lot on conditions, on the environmental temperature, for example, and different sleep stages may be related in different ways. So for me, one of the very interesting observations is that REM sleep, or paradoxical sleep, is a state when thermoregulation is suspended in some way or very severely compromised. You can observe it, for example, I think the study was done maybe in dogs who start panting when it gets warm. So they sleep in a room, and you increase the room temperature, and they start panting to lose a heat. Humans would be sweating, and you do it during non-REM sleep. But when you enter REM sleep, it stops. So people stop sweating, dog stops panting, and the body temperature increases. And the opposite happens when you cool down. You don't shiver during REM sleep. You actually start cooling down, and then eventually either you wake up or you start losing REM sleep. So it's actually one idea why marine mammals have so little or no REM sleep, in fact, is because they would just cool down. They're always in the cold water. So this one idea, there is a very good correlation between how aquatic you are and how much REM sleep you have across species. So there is this very interesting relationship.
And you mentioned previously that you have done experiments where you look at the effects of psychedelics on sleep. What types of experiments did you do, and what did you guys find?
So we started with a very basic question: how psychedelics affect sleep, and in general, what is the relationship between effects of psychedelics and sleep-wake states and brain activity? And we were really amazed. We started a few years back how little has been done, and how few papers, mostly very old papers. And this is interesting for many reasons. So, for example, now, as you probably know, the very popular idea is that therapeutic effects of psychedelics are mediated by the effects on synaptic plasticity.
Mm-hmm.
But there is so much evidence, as we were discussing also today, that to waking and sleep, they affect synaptic strands, sometimes in a very significant ways. So arguably, psychedelic effects would be dependent whether you have been awake or asleep at the time, just before the time when you're taking the drug, right? And I'm actually surprised that this is still completely left out of this psychedelic mainstream, that in the field, nobody really looking into sleep-wake history, which is hugely relevant, right? If you want to apply it, give it to patients with conditions like depression, their sleep is very much altered in very different ways. Some patients with depression would be sleeping a lot, others would be sleeping very little, and this may affect how they respond to psychedelics. So really, I hope that maybe in the future some clinical trials will start taking this into account. But another is acute effects, like what is this brain state produced by psychedelics? So our most recent study was 5-MeO-DMT. It's a short-acting compound. We give it to mice, and the effect is really striking. So these animals, they continue walking, they behave as they're awake, but their brain is in a completely sleep-like state.
How do you administer it to the animals?
We give an injection
Okay.
of the compound, IP. So this is a very intraperitoneally. It's a very common route of administering substance to animals. It's very quick. It's painless, and the animals enter this very very peculiar sleepwalking state. So they are wandering around with beautiful slow waves. So the student who was working on this project, Benjamin Briand, so he constructed a device with tiny cameras to put in front of the eye, and he finds that the pupil diameter increases a lot during this when mouse is tripping. It produces most beautiful slow waves and wandering around with dilated pupils and with slow. It produces a very very peculiar state. So what this means, we don't know yet. So we started kind of looking a bit into the mechanisms, but arguably, I mean, understanding this state is very important for understanding how and why psychedelics work.
Yeah. So you see slow wave sleeps with 5-MeO-DMT. Have you looked at other drugs yet? And I would make the prediction you're probably like, if you compare 5-MeO-DMT to something else like psilocybin, especially depending on the dose, I suspect you'll see very different brain states.
Yeah, we have kind of limited. We didn't do many studies. We did another study with psilocin. As you say, it can be dose dependent. So I really cannot promise that what we observe is because this is how psilocin work or it is the dose. But the psilocin was largely wake promoting. The animals were walking around for a while, and then the slow waves were also increased, although not to the same extent as after 5-MeO-DMT. Then they tried to fall asleep, but they would switch back and forth. They kept trying to fall asleep.
They couldn't sustain sleep.
They could not sustain sleep, but they did have increased slow waves during waking, even during REM sleep. So they also enter some sort of mixed or hybrid state.
And did you guys look at all at subsequent sleep after the drug was gone? So in other words, you administer a psychedelic like 5-MeO-DMT or psilocin. Does it affect sleep architecture or depth, say, the next day?
We are looking now at 5-MeO-DMT. Yeah, that's exactly. So we have another student who is now analyzing this data. We do not know yet. With psilocin, we didn't find any delayed effects, but what we found is if we kept mice awake while experiencing the drug, then the animal kind of showed higher sleep drive or higher sleep pressure. It looks like the waking that we produce was more maybe active, more intense, and therefore it required more intense sleep later on. So it definitely does something to the state, to the sleep architecture, but we are at the very beginning of this, and I really hope that other labs will start looking at this in more detail.
And so because you're a sleep researcher and sleep biologist, does that make you very religious about your own sleep routines? Do you have like particular things that you're very, very mindful of when you protect your own sleep?
No, not really. What I learned is not to worry about my sleep. So yeah, so I sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night. There is always something to worry about, but what I don't worry about is about just the fact that I woke up. The worst thing to do is to try and try to fall asleep, because then you will never fall asleep. You need to start thinking about something else, and I don't know. There are many tricks and people use that. Again, I don't have my own recipe that I could share here.
And so one final question I'll ask you, just sort of a forward-looking question, a broad question, but this is a big mystery. Like, why do animals sleep? Obviously, this is what you're spending your career on. Lots of people are working on this. People have argued about it for a long time. On the one hand, as you mentioned on your website and in this discussion, we've learned a lot over the past years about many different aspects of sleep in many different animals. And yet we still have this core mystery of like, what is the fundamental biological thing that sleep is doing for animals? Are there any upcoming experiments that you're doing or that you think will happen in the relatively near term that will likely bring us closer to a real answer to this question? Or do you think that it's an almost intractable intractable problem for whatever reason.
Well, definitely, I hope that it's tractable. I hope it will remain a mystery during my lifetime, because it would be really so. If you solve the mystery of sleep, then what is the next? But I'm pretty sure, yeah, we are not there yet. So the field will continue, will grow. So one very important research direction in my lab now and with a group of collaborators is the idea that sleep states are controlled not by subcortical circuitry. And this was the long-standing idea that there is a switch in the hypothalamus that dictates when to be awake or asleep. We instead find that the neocortex that was always kind of neglected for some reason in this discussion appears to be very important. So a collaborator of mine, Lucas Kron and Zoltan Molnar, working on new mouse models where they could manipulate cortical activity, and this is now a very new, very interesting research directions that stimulated several other labs who joined this effort. So we still have a lot to discover about kind of basic brain circuitry that controls and regulates sleep. I think there is a lot of kind of future in this direction.
All right. Well, I mean, this has been fascinating. We've touched on a lot. There's even more that we could have gone into. Is there anything you want to reiterate from what we discussed, or any final thoughts you want to leave people with about sleep and just where the field's at and where it could go, or anything like that?
Maybe the only thing I would mention is that we cannot understand sleep is when we look at sleep only in the very controlled standard lab conditions. And another is that how I like to look at sleep on a spectrum of states, and this is why I'm interested in hibernation and psychedelics in addition to sleep. So there are many interesting, fascinating states that we are capable of producing. Maybe there are some states we're not aware of. I think probably the truth, the final answers will be much more interesting than we can imagine right now.
All right. Well, once again, thank you for your time. I appreciate you joining me, especially across the ocean here, all the way in the UK. I'm on the west coast of the US, so we're at quite a distance here. But yeah, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to seeing what comes out of your lab next.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's well a pleasure to talk.